1200 BC, the Late Bronze Age. For over 1,000 years, bronze had been the unchallenged king of warfare. Swords, spears, armour, all forged from copper and tin alloys that had built empires and toppled kingdoms. The Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, every great civilization of the Mediterranean and Near East had risen to power on the strength of bronze weapons. But in the workshops of Assyria, something revolutionary was taking shape. Something that would render 1,000 years of military tradition obsolete in a single generation. Iron. The year is approximately 911 BC. King Adad-nirari II sits on the throne of Assyria, a kingdom that had spent the previous 2 centuries in decline, watching as rival powers carved away its territory piece by piece. The great Assyrian Empire of the Middle Bronze Age was a fading memory. Babylon to the south had grown strong. The Aramean tribes to the west raided with impunity. The mountain kingdoms of Urartu to the north pressed down from their highland fortresses. Assyria, once the terror of the ancient world, had become just another struggling kingdom fighting for survival. But Adad-nirari II possessed something his enemies did not. His armies were equipped with iron weapons, not just ceremonial pieces or decorative items, but combat-ready swords, spearheads, and arrowheads forged from carburized iron, what we would call steel. And more critically, his soldiers wore iron scale armour, proof against the bronze weapons that had dominated warfare for millennia. The transformation had been gradual. Iron working had existed for centuries, but the techniques were primitive. Early iron was brittle, inferior to bronze in almost every way. The Hittites had guarded their ironworking secrets closely during the Late Bronze Age, but when their empire collapsed around 1200 BC during the Bronze Age collapse, that knowledge scattered across the Near East. Assyrian smiths, working in the shadow of national decline, had spent 2 centuries perfecting techniques that the Hittites had only begun to explore. The key breakthrough came in understanding carbonization. Pure iron is relatively soft, easy to bend, unsuitable for weapons, but iron heated in contact with charcoal absorbs carbon atoms into its crystalline structure. The result is steel, harder than bronze, capable of holding a sharper edge, and crucially, far more abundant than bronze could ever be. Bronze required tin, a rare metal that had to be imported over vast distances. The collapse of trade networks during the Bronze Age catastrophe had made tin increasingly scarce and expensive. A bronze sword represented a significant investment, requiring copper from Cyprus or Anatolia and tin from as far away as Afghanistan. Losing weapons in battle was an economic disaster. Iron, by contrast, was everywhere. Iron ore deposits existed throughout the Near East. Bog iron could be collected from marshes. Even meteoritic iron, while rare, was more accessible than tin. But the true revolution was not just in the material, it was in what that material made possible. An Assyrian soldier in 911 BC, equipped with an iron sword and iron scale armour, was functionally invulnerable to enemy bronze weapons. A bronze sword, striking iron armour with the techniques warriors had used for centuries, would dent, chip, or shatter. The bronze blade, softer than the iron scales, took the worst of the impact. Meanwhile, the iron sword in the Assyrian's hand could shear through bronze armour, cutting the metal itself rather than relying on blunt force trauma to break bones beneath. Adad-nirari II launched his first campaign in 910 BC, moving against the Aramean tribes that had been raiding Assyrian territory for generations. The Arameans were experienced warriors, their bronze weapons and tactics proven over decades of successful raids. They had defeated Assyrian armies before, they expected to do so again. The Battle of Katmuhu, though poorly documented, marked the first major engagement where the full weight of Assyria's new military technology was deployed. Aramean warriors, confident in their bronze panoply, charged the Assyrian lines expecting a conventional battle. They had fought Assyrians before, they knew what to expect. What they encountered instead was unprecedented. Assyrian soldiers, protected by iron scale armour, stood firm against the Aramean charge. Bronze swords that should have cleaved through leather and cloth armour instead rang uselessly against iron scales. Aramean warriors, trained to fight opponents in similar equipment, found their attacks ineffective. Meanwhile, Assyrian iron swords cut through bronze shields. Iron-tipped arrows punched through bronze chest plates. The technological disparity was absolute. an Aramean chieftain, his name lost to history, was captured after Katmuhu and interrogated by Assyrian scribes. The interrogation record, preserved on a fragmentary clay tablet discovered at Kalhu, records his statement. "Their armour turned our blades. Our bronze could not bite their iron. Our shields split like wood. Their swords cut through bronze as through copper. We fought demons, not men." The psychological impact was immediate. Warriors who had spent their entire lives training with bronze weapons, who understood the weight, the balance, the cutting power of bronze swords, suddenly found their expertise worthless. A lifetime of martial skill meant nothing when your weapon bounced off enemy armour, while theirs cut through yours like parchment. Adad-nirari too understood that he possessed more than a military advantage. He held a monopoly on a transformative technology. Assyrian ironworking techniques were state secrets, guarded as carefully as nuclear weapon designs in the modern era. Foreign smiths were forbidden from learning the carbonization process. Iron weapons were never left on battlefields if they could be recovered. The economic and strategic value of maintaining this monopoly was incalculable. The campaigns continued. In 908 BC, Assyrian armies moved south against Babylon. The Babylonians, heirs to centuries of military tradition, deployed their finest troops. Bronze-armoured spearmen, the elite of the Babylonian military, formed shield walls that had broken countless charges. They had defeated Assyrian armies before, during Assyria's long decline. The battle near the border fortress of Araphe demonstrated the tactical revolution iron weapons enabled. Babylonian spear formations designed to exploit the longer reach of spears against swords found their advantage negated. Iron-tipped Assyrian arrows, shot from composite bows at long range, punched through bronze armour that would have stopped bronze arrowheads. Babylonian casualties mounted before the armies even closed to melee range. When the lines finally met, the result was slaughter. Babylonian spears, tipped with bronze, could not penetrate Assyrian iron armour. The carefully maintained spear wall, dependent on keeping enemy infantry at spear length, collapsed as Assyrian swordsmen advanced through the spear points with impunity. Iron swords cut through bronze spear shafts, snapped bronze sword blades, and sheared through the bronze scales of Babylonian armour. A Babylonian scribe recording the defeat wrote in cuneiform on a tablet discovered at Babylon, "The army of Ashur came against us, clad in armour our weapons could not pierce. Their blades cut through bronze as through clay. 3,000 of our finest soldiers fell. The king's guard was destroyed. We retreated in disorder, having achieved nothing but the death of brave men against an enemy we could not harm." The pattern repeated across the Near East. Kingdom after kingdom discovered that their Bronze Age militaries were obsolete. The kingdom of Hanigal-Bat, a powerful Aramean state, fell in 894 BC after a campaign season in which Assyrian forces systematically destroyed their armies. Bitadini, another Aramean kingdom controlling key territory along the Euphrates, held out for several years but ultimately succumbed to Assyrian military superiority. What made the Assyrian conquests particularly devastating was not just battlefield victories but the systematic nature of their campaigns. Adad-nirari II and his successors did not simply defeat enemy armies. They destroyed the economic basis for resistance. Cities were besieged, captured, and their populations deported. Agricultural lands were seized, trade routes were controlled. The Assyrian Empire was being rebuilt on the corpse of the Bronze Age world. By 891 BC, when Adad-nirari Teku died, Assyria had reconquered vast territories. The kingdom that had been fighting for survival 20 years earlier now dominated northern Mesopotamia, and the secret of their success was carefully guarded in Assyrian workshops, where smiths continued perfecting ironworking techniques. But technology, no matter how closely guarded, eventually spreads. The process was gradual, slower than it might have been in a more connected world, but inevitable. Captured Assyrian weapons were examined. Smiths in enemy kingdoms experimented with iron. Assyrian ironworkers, captured in raids or defecting for various reasons, brought knowledge to foreign courts. The kingdom of Urartu, Assyria's great rival to the north, was among the first to develop independent iron technology. Urartian smiths, working with local iron ore deposits in the Armenian highlands, mastered carbonization techniques by approximately 860 BC. The technological monopoly was breaking down, but by then, Assyria had used its 50-year advantage to build an empire. Tukulti-Ninurta II, who succeeded Adad-nirari II in 890 BC, inherited a powerful military machine and a growing empire. His own campaigns, recorded in annals carved on palace walls, continued the pattern of iron-equipped armies crushing Bronze Age opponents. The inscription from Tukulti-Ninurta II's palace at Assur records a campaign against the Nairi lands, a confederation of small kingdoms in the mountains north of Assyria. I marched against the lands of Nairi who had withheld tribute. My warriors, clad in iron, descended upon them like a storm. Their bronze could not stand against Assyrian iron. Their fortresses fell. Their soldiers fled. I took 20 cities in 30 days. The speed of Assyrian conquest was itself revolutionary. Bronze Age warfare had been characterized by long sieges, seasonal campaigns, and limited territorial gains. The technological superiority of iron weapons changed this calculus. Cities that might have held out for months against Bronze Age siege equipment fell in weeks to iron tools. Assyrian soldiers with iron picks and axes could demolish mud brick fortifications faster than defenders could repair them. Ashurnasirpal II, ascending to the throne in 883 BC, would take Assyrian military dominance to new heights. His reign marked the mature phase of the Iron Age Assyrian military, where iron weapons were combined with sophisticated siege technology, professional standing armies, and systematic terror tactics designed to break enemy resistance before battle was even joined. The annals of Ashurnasirpal II, carved extensively on palace walls at Kalhu, provide detailed accounts of his campaigns. Unlike earlier kings whose inscriptions focused on bare facts, Ashurnasirpal's scribes recorded tactics, casualties, and the psychological warfare that accompanied Assyrian military operations. In 883 BC, Ashurnasirpal marched west against the Aramean city-states of Syria. These kingdoms, having witnessed Assyrian conquest for decades, understood the threat. Several cities formed a defensive coalition, pooling their bronze-equipped armies and preparing their fortifications. They had time to prepare, intelligence about Assyrian methods, and determination to resist. The city of Bitadini, controlling the crucial Euphrates crossing, became the focus of Assyrian attention. The city walls were substantial, the garrison was large, and the defenders were motivated by knowledge of what Assyrian conquest meant. They expected a long siege, counting on their fortifications and supplies to outlast the Assyrian army. What they faced instead was a military machine that operated on different principles than anything the Bronze Age had produced. Assyrian engineers using iron tools constructed siege towers, battering rams with iron heads, and siege ramps at a speed that shocked defenders. What should have taken months took weeks. The walls of Bitadini, which had stood for generations, were breached in 15 days. The assault, when it came, was executed by soldiers in iron armour carrying iron weapons. The defenders, fighting with bronze swords and spears, found themselves in the same hopeless situation that had befallen dozens of cities before them. Ashurnasirpal's annals record the result with clinical precision. I filled the streets with their corpses. I made a pillar of living men and another of heads. I impaled soldiers on stakes before the city gates. I flayed the nobles and covered the city walls with their skins. The brutality was not mindless savagery. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to break the will to resist. Cities that heard what happened at Bitadini faced a choice: surrender immediately and accept deportation and tribute, or resist and face annihilation. The economic calculation was straightforward. Assyria could replace losses, its enemies could not. The iron weapons made this strategy viable. In Bronze Age warfare, excessive casualties were economically catastrophic. Every lost soldier represented not just training and experience, but expensive bronze equipment that could not easily be replaced. Assyrian soldiers, equipped with iron weapons forged from abundant local ore, were more economically replaceable. The mathematics of attrition favoured Assyria absolutely. By 870 BC, Ashurnasirpal II controlled territory from the Zagros Mountains in the east to the Mediterranean coast in the west. The Assyrian Empire had been reborn, and its foundation was iron weapons. But the empire now faced a new challenge. As iron technology spread, the military advantage that had enabled rapid conquest was diminishing. The kingdom of Urartu, having mastered iron working, began challenging Assyrian dominance in the north. Eurasian armies, now equipped with iron weapons and armour comparable to Assyrian equipment, fought Assyrian forces to a standstill in the mountains of Armenia. The wars between Assyria and Urartu in the mid-9th century BC were the first major conflicts fought by armies on technological parity since the Iron Revolution began. The Battle of Mount Ararat, fought sometime around 860 BC, though poorly documented, represented a turning point. Two Iron Age armies, both equipped with steel weapons and iron armour, met in a conventional engagement without significant technological disparity. The result was a brutal, grinding battle that ended inconclusively. Assyria could no longer rely on material superiority alone. This forced evolution in Assyrian military practice. Shalmaneser III, ruling from 858 to 824 BC, faced enemies who increasingly possessed iron weapons. His solution was to expand and professionalize the Assyrian military even further, creating the first true standing army in history. Professional soldiers, trained year-round and equipped with standardized iron weapons, replaced the seasonal levy armies of the Bronze Age. The Assyrian army under Shalmaneser III numbered perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 men at its peak, an unprecedented force in ancient warfare. This army was divided into specialized units: heavy infantry with iron scale armor and long spears, light infantry with iron swords and shields, archers with composite bows and iron-tipped arrows, cavalry on horseback and chariot forces. The standardization was itself revolutionary. Every soldier in a unit was equipped identically with weapons and armour produced in royal arsenals to consistent specifications. This uniformity, impossible in the Bronze Age when each bronze weapon was individually forged, was made practical by iron's abundance. Assyrian arsenals could produce thousands of identical iron swords, spearheads, and armour scales, equipping entire armies with standardized gear. Shalmaneser's campaigns extended Assyrian power even further. His annals record 32 military campaigns, marching against Babylon, Urartu, the Aramean kingdoms of Syria, and even challenging Egypt's influence in the Levant. The scope of operations was unprecedented, made possible by the economic advantages of iron weapons and the organizational sophistication of the Assyrian military state. The Battle of Karkar in 853 BC represented the high point of Shalmaneser's power and demonstrated both the strength and limitations of Assyrian military dominance. Shalmaneser marched west with perhaps 50,000 to 60,000 troops, intending to subjugate the Aramean kingdoms of Syria and extend Assyrian control to the Mediterranean. What he encountered was a coalition of unprecedented size. 12 kings from across Syria and the Levant had allied against Assyria, pooling their resources to create an army that, according to Assyrian records, numbered 70,000 soldiers. This coalition, led by Hadadezer of Damascus and Irheleni of Hamath, represented the greatest military challenge Assyria had faced in decades. Critically, by 853 BC, many of the coalition members possessed iron weapons. The monopoly Assyria had enjoyed for 50 years was broken. The technological advantage that had enabled rapid conquest was neutralized. The battle that followed was fought between armies equipped with similar metallurgy. Shalmaneser's annals claim a great victory, recording 14,000 enemy dead. Archaeological and textual analysis suggests the truth was more complex. The battle was probably a tactical stalemate or marginal Assyrian victory that failed to achieve strategic objectives. Shalmaneser withdrew from Syria, and the coalition states retained their independence. It was the first time in 50 years that an Assyrian army had failed to achieve its campaign objectives against a major enemy force. The Battle of Karkar demonstrated that iron weapons, while revolutionary, were not sufficient alone to guarantee military success once both sides possessed them. What mattered was training, logistics, organization, and resources. Assyria maintained advantages in all these areas, but the crushing superiority of the early Iron Age campaigns was gone. However, the fundamental economic advantage of iron over bronze remained. Even as iron technology spread, Assyria's position as the first to fully develop it gave lasting advantages. Assyrian workshops had 50 years more experience in iron metallurgy than their rivals. Assyrian iron weapons were generally of higher quality, using more advanced carbonization techniques and better understanding of heat treatment. The Assyrian military-industrial complex by the mid-9th century BC was producing weapons and armour at scales unimaginable to Bronze Age kingdoms. Royal arsenals at Kalhu, Nineveh, and Assur employed thousands of smiths, supported by administrative structures that managed iron ore procurement, charcoal production, and distribution networks. This industrialized approach to weapon production, made possible by iron's abundance, gave Assyria quantitative advantages even when qualitative superiority diminished. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, beginning in 745 BC, marked a new phase in Assyrian military evolution. By this time, iron weapons were common throughout the Near East. The technological revolution was complete. What distinguished Assyria was no longer possession of iron technology, but the sophistication of its military system built on that technological foundation. Tiglath-Pileser III reformed the Assyrian army completely, creating a force that dominated the Near East for the next century. The army was enlarged to perhaps 250,000 men, organized into provincial standing forces that could be mobilized rapidly. The deportation policy, which had been practiced sporadically, became systematic, with conquered populations transferred to other parts of the empire and replaced with Assyrians or loyal subjects. But the core of Assyrian military power remained the same iron weapons that had enabled the empire's resurgence 150 years earlier. The iron sword, the iron-tipped spear, the iron scale armor, these technologies, revolutionary when first deployed by Adad-Nirari II, had become the standard equipment of Near Eastern warfare. The world had caught up to Assyria's innovation, but Assyria had used its century of advantage to build an empire that would dominate the region for 150 more years. The campaigns of Tiglath-Pileser III extended Assyrian control over the entire Fertile Crescent. Damascus fell in 732 BC after a siege, ending Aramean independence in Syria. Babylon was conquered and placed under direct Assyrian rule in 729 BC, ending a rivalry that stretched back centuries. The Kingdom of Israel was invaded and its population deported in 722 BC during the reign of Shalmaneser Thumiv and Sargon II. These conquests were executed by armies equipped with iron weapons, but the tactics, strategy, and organization had evolved far beyond the simple, technological superiority of the early campaigns. Assyrian armies in the late 8th century BC were sophisticated military machines, combining heavy infantry, cavalry, siege engineers, and logistics corps in coordinated operations that could sustain campaigns across hundreds of miles and multiple campaign seasons. The siege of Damascus demonstrated the mature Assyrian military system. Tiglath-Pileser surrounded the city with a force of perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 troops, cutting off all supply routes. Assyrian siege engineers constructed siege towers, battering rams, and siege ramps using standardized techniques refined over a century of siege warfare. The walls were breached systematically, section by section, until resistance collapsed. But what made the siege possible was iron. The tools that demolished the walls were iron. The weapons that killed defenders were iron. The armor that protected attackers was iron. And crucially, the economic system that could sustain an army of tens of thousands of men for months away from Assyrian territory was built on the abundance and affordability of iron weapons. If the same siege had been attempted with Bronze Age technology, the economics would have been prohibitive. The cost of equipping 30,000 men with bronze weapons and armor would have bankrupted most Bronze Age kingdoms. The Assyrian Empire, with its iron-based military economy, could field multiple armies this size simultaneously. By 700 BC, Assyria under Sennacherib controlled an empire stretching from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the Mediterranean to the Zagros Mountains. It was the largest empire the ancient Near East had yet seen, and it existed because 200 years earlier, Assyrian smiths had perfected the techniques for forging iron weapons. The irony, of course, is that iron technology eventually armed Assyria's enemies as well. The Medes and Babylonians, who would destroy the Assyrian Empire in 612 BC, wielded iron weapons forged using techniques learned, directly or indirectly, from Assyria. The Persian Empire that succeeded Assyria was built on iron-equipped armies. The technological revolution Assyria had pioneered became universal. But for 2 centuries, from approximately 911 to 700 BC, Assyria dominated the ancient Near East, primarily because it was the first kingdom to fully exploit iron metallurgy for military purposes. The transition from bronze to iron was not merely a change in materials, it was a fundamental transformation in the economics of warfare, the scale of military operations possible, and the nature of empire itself. The Assyrian soldier of 700 BC, standing guard on the walls of Nineveh, equipped with an iron sword forged in royal arsenals, wearing iron-scale armour produced in industrial quantities, was the culmination of a 200-year military revolution. He was the distant descendant of the Assyrian soldiers who had faced Aramean warriors at Katmuhu in 910 BC and discovered that their iron armour made them invincible against bronze weapons. The laughter of those early enemies, confident in their bronze weapons and traditional tactics, had died quickly when iron cut through bronze like parchment through butter. The survivors had carried tales of Assyrian invincibility that became the foundation of Assyrian psychological warfare. Resist and die, or surrender and live as subjects of an empire built on superior metallurgy and ruthless efficiency. The archaeological record of this transformation is extensive. Excavations at Assyrian sites have uncovered thousands of iron weapons and armour components. The royal arsenals at Kalhu have yielded standardized iron swords, spearheads, arrowheads, and armour scales, all produced to consistent specifications. Chemical analysis of these artifacts reveals sophisticated metallurgy, with carbon contents indicating deliberate carburization to produce steel. At enemy sites across the Near East, the same story appears. Layers of destruction dating to the 9th and 8th centuries BC, filled with the debris of Assyrian conquest. In these destruction layers, alongside the broken pottery and burned timbers, lie bronze weapons, cut and shattered by iron blades. The physical evidence confirms what the texts record. Iron weapons cut through bronze, rendering centuries of military tradition obsolete in a generation. The kingdom of Hamath, excavated extensively in the 20th century, provides particularly clear evidence. The destruction layer from approximately 720 BC, when Sargon II conquered the city, contains dozens of bronze swords with characteristic damage patterns, shattered blades, deep notches from iron weapons, bent and broken spearheads. In the same layers lie iron Assyrian weapons, many damaged but none showing the catastrophic failure patterns of the bronze weapons. Metallurgical analysis confirms the disparity. The bronze weapons from Hamath contain 10 to 12% tin, the standard alloy composition for Bronze Age weapons. Hardness testing gives values around 200 to 250 on the Vickers scale. The iron Assyrian weapons, tested where carbon content is measurable, show hardness values of 400 to 600 on the Vickers scale, nearly twice as hard as the bronze weapons they faced. The implications were absolute. In any direct weapon-on-weapon contact, bronze swords would chip, notch, or break, while iron swords remained intact. Bronze armour would be cut or pierced, while iron armour resisted bronze weapons. The technological disparity was not marginal. It was overwhelming, at least in the early decades of the Assyrian resurgence. The spread of iron technology through the Near East followed, predictable patterns. Kingdoms on Assyria's borders, facing existential threats, prioritized acquiring iron weapons and developing independent ironworking capabilities. Urartu's early mastery of ironworking was driven by military necessity. The Aramean kingdoms of Syria, after experiencing defeat, attempted to develop iron weapons, though generally lagging behind Assyrian metallurgy by decades. More distant kingdoms adopted iron more slowly. Egypt, protected by distance and desert, continued using bronze weapons well into the 8th century BC. The Nubian kingdom of Kush, even further south, was among the last major powers to transition to iron. But eventually, economic logic drove the change. Iron weapons, once the technology was mastered, were simply cheaper and better than bronze. By approximately 600 BC, the Iron Age was fully established across the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. Bronze weapons disappeared from military contexts except as decorative items or ceremonial objects. The great Bronze Age civilizations, their military traditions, their weapon designs, their tactical systems, all became obsolete, replaced by Iron Age warfare that operated on fundamentally different principles. But the transition period, roughly 900 to 700 BC, belonged to Assyria. Those 2 centuries, when Assyria possessed superior iron weapons and used them to build an empire, represented one of history's most dramatic examples of how technological advantage translates to geopolitical dominance. The soldiers who fought in those early campaigns, who discovered that their iron weapons cut through enemy bronze armour, while enemy bronze weapons bounced off their iron scales, experienced something unprecedented in ancient warfare. They were effectively invulnerable to enemy weapons while capable of killing enemies at will. The psychological impact on both Assyrian soldiers and their enemies cannot be overstated. For Assyrian warriors, the knowledge that their equipment made them superior created a culture of military confidence that persisted even after technological parity was reached. Assyrian military inscriptions from the 8th and 7th centuries BC radiate confidence, describing enemies as insects to be crushed, rebels to be destroyed, obstacles to be swept aside. This confidence had its roots in the early Iron Age campaigns, when material superiority made Assyrian victory nearly inevitable. For Assyria's enemies, the experience created the opposite effect. Kingdoms that had successfully resisted Assyrian power in the Bronze Age found themselves helpless against Iron Age Assyrian armies. The psychological trauma of military impotence, of fighting enemies your weapons could not harm, created a legacy of fear that Assyrian kings exploited ruthlessly. The Assyrian propaganda machine, sophisticated by ancient standards, broadcast tales of Assyrian invincibility throughout the empire and beyond. Royal inscriptions, deliberately distributed in multiple languages and left at conquered sites, described Assyrian victories in terms designed to terrify. The message was clear: resistance is futile, Assyrian power is absolute, submit or die. This psychological warfare was built on the foundation of iron weapons. The material advantage made the propaganda believable. Cities that might have resisted longer surrendered faster because defenders knew that Assyrian iron would cut through their bronze defences. The mere presence of Assyrian armies, with their distinctive iron-scale armour glinting in the sun, was enough to break enemy morale before battle was joined. The economic impact of the Iron Revolution extended far beyond military applications. The abundance of iron, compared to bronze, democratized access to metal tools. Farmers could afford iron plowshares, increasing agricultural productivity. Craftsmen could use iron tools that held edges longer and worked harder materials. Construction projects used iron implements that made work faster and easier. But military applications drove development. The demand for iron weapons created industries that trained thousands of smiths, established supply chains for iron ore and charcoal, developed quality control systems, and invented new techniques. This industrial infrastructure, created to supply Assyrian armies, eventually supported broader economic development. The Assyrian royal arsenals were effectively the world's first industrial metalworking centres. At Kalhu, archaeological evidence suggests workshops covering several acres, with dozens of forges operating simultaneously, producing hundreds of weapons daily. The scale of production required sophisticated organisation, ore procurement from multiple sources, charcoal production from managed forests, distribution networks to move finished weapons to military units across the empire. Modern estimates suggest that at peak production in the 8th century BC, Assyrian arsenals were producing perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 iron weapons annually, enough to equip new soldiers, replace losses, and maintain stockpiles. This industrial capacity, unprecedented in the ancient world, was both cause and effect of Assyrian military dominance. The empire could sustain losses that would have crippled Bronze Age kingdoms because weapons could be replaced quickly from production centres. An entire army's equipment, lost in a campaign disaster, could be remanufactured in months rather than years. This resilience, built on iron's abundance, made Assyrian power nearly impossible to break through attrition. Compare this to Bronze Age warfare, where losing an army meant losing years of accumulated bronze weapons that could not easily be replaced. Bronze Age kings calculated risks differently, avoiding battles that might result in heavy equipment losses even if tactically advantageous. Assyrian kings with renewable iron weapon supplies could fight more aggressively, accept higher casualties, and pursue decisive victory rather than limited objectives. This shift in strategic calculation, enabled by iron metallurgy, changed how wars were fought and won. Assyrian campaigns aimed for total victory. Enemy armies destroyed, cities conquered, populations deported, territory annexed. Bronze Age warfare, constrained by equipment scarcity, tended toward limited objectives and negotiated settlements. The Iron Age introduced total war, and Assyria pioneered the practice. The human cost was staggering. Assyrian inscriptions casually record massacres of thousands, deportations of tens of thousands, systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure. The brutality was not unique to Assyria, but Assyria's iron-based military power made it unusually capable of inflicting this brutality systematically across a vast empire. The Kingdom of Elam provides a representative example. For centuries, Elam had been a rival power to Mesopotamian states, sometimes dominant, sometimes subjugated, but always a factor in Near Eastern geopolitics. Assyrian campaigns against Elam in the 7th century BC, particularly under Ashurbanipal, were genocidal in scope. Assyrian armies, equipped with iron weapons, systematically destroyed Elamite cities, depopulated regions, and demolished irrigation systems that supported agriculture. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal's inscriptions describe the destruction of Susa, Elam's capital, with satisfaction. "I tore up the ziggurat of Susa, its bronze pillars. I removed the sacred groves where Elamite kings made offerings. I destroyed it so thoroughly that even the places where it stood will be forgotten. I sowed salt over the ruins so that nothing will ever grow there again." This level of systematic destruction was enabled by military superiority that ultimately rested on iron weapons. An army equipped with bronze weapons, operating under Bronze Age economic constraints, could not have sustained the campaigns necessary to so thoroughly destroy a kingdom the size of Elam. The logistics alone would have been prohibitive, but Assyrian armies, with iron weapons forged from abundant local ore, could campaign for years in enemy territory, replacing losses and maintaining pressure until resistance collapsed completely. By the late 7th century BC, Assyrian power had reached its apogee. The empire stretched from the Nile to the Persian Gulf. No rival power could challenge Assyrian military dominance in open battle, and yet, within a generation, the empire would collapse completely, conquered by a coalition of Medes and Babylonians who wielded the same iron weapons Assyria had pioneered. The fall of Assyria in 612 BC, when Nineveh was captured and destroyed, is often portrayed as sudden, but the underlying causes had been building for decades. The empire was overextended, its administrative system straining to control vast territories filled with resentful subject populations. Military garrisons spread thin across hundreds of cities could not simultaneously suppress internal rebellions and defend borders against external threats. More critically, Assyria's military advantage had disappeared. By 620 BC, the Medes possessed iron weapons and armour equal to Assyrian equipment. The Babylonians, who had chafed under Assyrian rule for generations, had developed independent ironworking capabilities and built armies capable of challenging Assyrian forces. The technological monopoly that had enabled empire building 2 centuries earlier was long gone. The coalition that destroyed Assyria was itself a product of the Iron Age. The Median and Babylonian armies that besieged Nineveh wielded iron swords forged using techniques learned, directly or indirectly, from Assyria. The siege towers that breached Nineveh's walls were built with iron tools. The soldiers who killed Assyrian defenders wore iron-scale armour copied from Assyrian designs. In a sense, Assyria fell to its own innovation. By pioneering iron weapons and using them to build an empire, Assyria had forced neighbouring kingdoms to develop iron technology and self-defence. Once that technology spread, Assyria lost its decisive advantage. What remained was a hated empire surrounded by enemies who possessed the weapons to destroy it. The Battle of Nineveh in 612 BC, which ended Assyrian independence, was fought between Iron Age armies on technological parity. The siege lasted several months, with Assyrian defenders, equipped with iron weapons and armour, fighting from behind massive walls against attackers equipped with equally effective iron weapons. It was a test of numbers, resources, and determination, not technology. The coalition prevailed through numerical superiority and superior motivation. Assyrian defenders were fighting for an empire increasingly unable to support them. Coalition attackers were fighting to end generations of Assyrian domination. When the walls were breached, the slaughter was total. Archaeological excavations at Nineveh have uncovered mass graves from the final battle, containing thousands of bodies, many with evidence of violent death from iron weapons. The irony is perfect. The Assyrian Empire, built on iron weapons, fell to enemies wielding iron weapons. The technological revolution Assyria had pioneered and exploited became the instrument of its destruction. The lesson, repeated throughout history, is that technological advantages are temporary. Once a transformative technology spreads, early advantages disappear. But for 2 centuries, Roughly 900 to 700 BC, Assyria dominated the ancient Near East primarily because it was first to fully exploit iron metallurgy for military purposes. In that period, iron weapons cut through bronze armour and bronze weapons shattered against iron, rewriting the rules of ancient warfare and enabling the construction of the largest empire the region had yet seen. The transformation from bronze to iron was not merely a change in materials. It represented a fundamental shift in the economics of warfare, the scale of military operations possible, and the nature of power itself. Bronze, requiring rare tin from distant sources, created natural limits on military size and sustainability. Iron, abundant and widespread, removed those limits. The first armies to fully exploit this change possessed overwhelming advantages. Assyrian soldiers in 900 BC, facing enemies with bronze weapons while wielding iron swords and wearing iron armour, experienced combat as fundamentally unequal. Their weapons could harm enemies. Enemy weapons could not harm them. It was as close to invincibility as ancient warfare permitted. That invincibility, temporary as it proved, was enough to build an empire. And that empire, however brutal and hated, demonstrated the power of technological innovation in warfare. 200 years later, when iron technology was universal, the lesson remained clear. Technological advantage, however temporary, can reshape the world. The Assyrian soldier of 650 BC, standing on the walls of Nineveh in the empire's final decades, carried an iron sword inherited from centuries of military tradition. He stood in armour forged using techniques perfected over generations. He was the culmination of a military revolution that began in obscure workshops 250 years earlier, when Assyrian smiths discovered how to forge iron weapons superior to anything the Bronze Age had produced. In 612 BC, when coalition forces broke through those walls and killed that soldier, they wielded iron weapons forged using the same techniques. The technological revolution was complete. The advantages it had briefly provided to its pioneers had spread universally, and the empire built on iron weapons fell to enemies armed with iron. But the revolution itself was permanent. The Iron Age, inaugurated by Assyrian military innovation, would dominate Near Eastern and Mediterranean warfare for the next 1,000 years. Bronze weapons, which had equipped armies from Egypt to Mesopotamia for millennia, became obsolete curiosities. The world had changed, permanently and completely. And it changed first on battlefields in northern Mesopotamia in the early 9th century BC, when Assyrian iron cut through bronze for the first time, and defenders realized with horror that their weapons, their tactics, their entire military tradition had become obsolete in an instant. The age of bronze was over, the age of iron had begun, and Assyria, for better or worse, was its pioneer. The physical evidence of this transformation lies scattered across archaeological sites throughout the Near East. At the ancient city of Nimrud, once the Assyrian capital of Kalhu, excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries uncovered the remains of royal arsenals that tell the story of industrialized iron weapon production. Room after room filled with iron arrowheads stacked by the thousands, iron sword blades in various stages of completion, iron scale armour pieces, standardized to interlock perfectly, produced in quantities that suggest mass manufacturing rather than individual craftsmanship. The British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard, excavating Nimrud in the 1840s, discovered what he called the armoury of Ashurnasirpal II. The rooms contained so many iron weapons and armour pieces that Layard's workers spent weeks simply cataloguing the finds. His notes describe thousands of arrowheads, hundreds of sword blades, and countless armour scales, all showing evidence of standardized production. Many pieces were identical, suggesting the use of moulds or templates to ensure uniformity. Modern archaeological analysis of these finds reveals sophisticated metallurgy. X-ray fluorescence and metallographic examination show deliberate alloying and heat treatment. The iron was not merely smelted and forged. It was carburized to produce steel, then carefully heat-treated to optimize hardness and toughness. Different weapon types received different treatments. Sword blades were hardened at the edge while keeping the spine softer for flexibility. Armour scales were case-hardened on the outer surface while maintaining a tough core. This level of sophistication did not appear overnight. It represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, passed from master smith to apprentice, refined through countless experiments and failures. The Assyrians did not invent ironworking, but they perfected it for military applications in ways that gave them decisive advantages for generations. The site of Dur-Sharrukin, modern Khorsabad, built by Sargon II in the late 8th century BC, provides additional evidence of Assyrian military industrial capacity. The palace complex included workshops specifically for weapon production, identifiable by the slag heaps, forge installations, and tool assemblages found during excavation. Chemical analysis of the slag reveals high-temperature iron smelting and steel production on an industrial scale. Adjacent to these workshops were storage facilities containing finished weapons. One room, excavated in the 1930s by the Oriental Institute of Chicago, contained over 160 iron swords stacked in wooden racks, all of identical length and weight. Another contained thousands of iron arrowheads organized by type. The level of organization suggests sophisticated inventory management and quality control systems. The weapons themselves show remarkable consistency. Measurements of surviving sword blades from various Assyrian sites reveal standardized dimensions. Blades average 60 to 70 centimeters in length, 4 to 5 centimeters in width at the hilt, tapering to pointed tips. The consistency across decades and different production sites indicates centralized design specifications and quality standards. This standardization had profound military implications. Soldiers could be trained on standardized weapons with techniques optimized for specific blade lengths and weights. Replacement weapons fit existing scabbards and belt fixtures. Repair parts were interchangeable. The logistical advantages of standardization, well understood in modern militaries, were pioneered by Assyrian arsenals manufacturing iron weapons. The contrast with Bronze Age weapon production is stark. Bronze weapons, due to the expense of materials and the complexity of casting, were typically produced individually or in small batches. Each weapon was slightly different. Warriors adapted their techniques to their specific weapons. Replacement was difficult because new weapons differed from old ones. The economics of bronze enforced individualization. Iron's abundance enabled standardization. When raw materials are cheap and production capacity is high, manufacturing identical items becomes economically rational. Assyrian arsenals supplied with iron ore from multiple sources and staffed by hundreds of trained smiths could produce weapons in quantities and with consistency that Bronze Age workshops could never approach. The military advantages extended beyond individual combat. Standardized weapons enabled tactical innovations impossible with individualized equipment. Phalanx formations, where soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder with identical weapons at identical lengths, became practical. Coordinated maneuvers, requiring precise timing and uniform capabilities, could be trained and executed. The Assyrian military machine operated with a precision that Bronze Age armies could not match. Training systems evolved to exploit standardized equipment. Assyrian military camps, identified at several sites through archaeological survey, show evidence of training facilities. At Tel Barsip on the Euphrates, excavations revealed what appears to be a military training ground with targets for archery practice, posts for sword drills, and open areas for formation training. The standardization of weapons meant training could be standardized as well. Assyrian soldiers were professionals, not seasonal levies. They trained year-round, unlike Bronze Age armies that assembled only for campaign seasons. This professionalization was economically viable because iron weapons were cheap enough to equip standing armies. Bronze Age kingdoms could not afford to keep large permanent forces equipped with expensive bronze weapons. Assyria, with its iron-based military economy, could maintain forces that trained continuously and fought with practiced coordination. The tactical sophistication of Assyrian armies reflected this professionalization. Assyrian reliefs from palace walls at Nineveh and Nimrud depict military operations with remarkable detail. Infantry advancing in ordered ranks, their shields overlapping, spears at identical angles, archers in coordinated volleys, releasing simultaneously, cavalry executing flanking maneuvers while infantry held the centre. These were not spontaneous mob actions, but drilled maneuvers executed by trained professionals. The siege warfare depicted in these reliefs shows equal sophistication. Siege towers advance on wheels, protected by wet hides against fire arrows, battering. Rams, their iron-tipped heads visible in the carvings, methodically demolish walls while archers provide covering fire. Engineers dig tunnels under fortifications while infantry assaults walls with scaling ladders. These coordinated combined arms operations required training, discipline, and standardized equipment. The famous siege reliefs from Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh, depicting the capture of Lachish in 701 BC, show Assyrian siege warfare in extraordinary detail. The reliefs, now in the British Museum, depict thousands of individual figures engaged in coordinated siege operations. Archaeological excavation at Lachish itself has confirmed the accuracy of these depictions. The siege ramp shown in the reliefs actually exists, visible today as a massive earthwork against the city walls. At Lachish, archaeologists found evidence of the fierce battle depicted in the reliefs, iron arrowheads by the thousands, scattered where Assyrian archers had fired covering volleys, iron sword fragments in the destruction layer, most tellingly, hundreds of iron scales from Assyrian armour lost during the assault. The physical evidence matches the artistic depiction, confirming that Assyrian reliefs, while propagandistic in intent, were accurate in detail. The iron arrowheads from Lachish are particularly revealing. Metallurgical analysis shows they were forged from medium carbon steel, hard enough to penetrate armour, but tough enough not to shatter on impact. The heads are remarkably uniform, suggesting mass production from standardized designs. Several different types are present, including bodkin points for armour penetration, broadheads for unarmoured targets, and barbed heads designed to be difficult to extract. This variety indicates sophisticated understanding of ballistics and wound mechanics. Assyrian armourers knew that different arrowhead designs served different purposes and produced arrows optimized for specific targets. Bronze Age arrowheads, expensive to produce, tended toward general-purpose designs. Iron arrowheads, cheap and abundant, could be specialized, with archers selecting appropriate types for their targets. The scale of arrow production and use was staggering. Estimates based on archaeological finds and textual evidence suggest Assyrian armies in major campaigns carried millions of arrows. The Lachish siege alone, lasting several months, probably involved the use of hundreds of thousands of arrows. This expenditure, economically prohibitive with bronze arrowheads, was feasible with iron. The mathematical advantage was overwhelming. An Assyrian archer, equipped with 40 or 50 arrows in his quiver and access to resupply from baggage trains carrying thousands more, could maintain sustained fire throughout extended engagements. Bronze Age archers, carrying perhaps 20 to 30 expensive bronze-tipped arrows and unable to resupply easily, had to ration shots carefully. This difference translated to tactical dominance. Assyrian archers could engage in suppressive fire, not aimed shots but volume fire designed to force enemies to take cover. They could shoot at distant targets with little concern for ammunition conservation. They could maintain arrow storms that made enemy movement suicidal. The Bronze Age concept of archery as precision shooting gave way to Iron Age archery as area suppression. The psychological impact on defenders was devastating. Soldiers sheltering behind walls or shields, while iron-tipped arrows fell like rain experienced helplessness that Bronze Age warfare rarely produced. The arrows kept coming, thousands upon thousands, until defenders either fled, surrendered, or died. The sheer abundance of ammunition created qualitatively different battlefield experiences. Infantry combat showed similar transformations. Assyrian heavy infantry, equipped with iron-tipped spears 6 to 8 feet long, iron swords as sidearms, and iron scale armour covering torso and limbs, were nearly invulnerable to enemy weapons while capable of killing at will. The iron spear tips, harder than bronze, could punch through bronze armour that would have stopped bronze spears. The iron swords, if combat closed to melee range, cut through bronze swords and armour with mechanical efficiency. The scale armour itself represented sophisticated engineering. Each scale, roughly 2 inches by 1 inch, was punched from sheet iron, hardened through heat treatment, then pierced with holes for attachment. Hundreds of scales were laced together with leather thongs or bronze wire to create flexible armour that protected vital areas while allowing movement. The labour investment was substantial, but iron's low material cost made scale armour economically viable for entire armies. Bronze scale armour, while known in the Bronze Age, was rare due to expense. Only elite warriors or wealthy nobles could afford it. Assyrian arsenals using cheap iron produced scale armour in quantities that equipped thousands of soldiers. This democratization of armour fundamentally changed infantry combat. Formations of armoured infantry, previously rare and elite, became standard Assyrian units. The tactical implications were profound. Armoured infantry could advance under arrow fire with acceptable casualties, closing to melee range where their iron weapons dominated. Bronze Age infantry, largely unarmoured due to cost, had to avoid arrow fire or suffer devastating casualties. Assyrian infantry could attack fortified positions directly, absorbing defender fire while approaching walls. This capability made Assyrian sieges far more aggressive and successful than Bronze Age sieges. Cavalry development paralleled infantry evolution. Assyrian cavalry, initially mounted spearmen, evolved into specialized units with iron weapons optimized for mounted combat. Iron swords with curved blades, better suited to cutting from horseback, appeared in the 8th century BC. Iron-tipped lances, longer and stronger than bronze equivalents, gave Assyrian cavalry reach advantages. Iron-scale armor for both horses and riders, while expensive even in iron, began appearing on elite cavalry units by the late 8th century. The development of cavalry as a battlefield arm was enabled by iron metallurgy. Cavalry weapons needed to be strong enough to survive the impacts of mounted combat while light enough for one-handed use. Bronze swords, while adequate, were vulnerable to breaking under the stresses of cavalry charges. Iron swords, with superior toughness, could withstand impacts that would shatter bronze blades. Assyrian cavalry tactics, described in texts and depicted in reliefs, exploited mobility and shock. Cavalry units would sweep around infantry formations, attacking flanks and rear, pursuing fleeing enemies, and screening friendly forces from enemy cavalry. These maneuvers, while not invented by Assyrians, were executed with effectiveness enabled by superior equipment. The horses themselves received iron equipment. Iron bits, stronger and more precisely crafted than bronze equivalents, gave riders better control. Iron horseshoes, a later development, protected hooves during long marches. Iron scale armour for horses, while heavy and expensive, protected valuable cavalry mounts from enemy arrows and spears. The economics again favoured Assyria. A cavalry force required not just trained riders, but trained horses, saddles, tack, weapons, and armour. The total investment per cavalryman was enormous, but iron reduced the weapons and armour portion of this cost dramatically. Assyria could field cavalry forces that would have bankrupted Bronze Age kingdoms. By the 7th century BC, Assyrian cavalry numbered in the thousands. Ashurbanipal's campaigns against Egypt in the 1660s BC deployed cavalry forces that Egyptian armies, still largely bronze-equipped, could not match. The mobility and striking power of iron-equipped cavalry gave Assyria operational advantages that translated to strategic dominance. The logistics of supporting these Iron Age armies were themselves revolutionary. Assyrian campaigns routinely operated hundreds of miles from home territory for months or years. This endurance was possible because iron weapons, unlike bronze weapons, could be manufactured in forward areas using local resources. Iron ore deposits existed throughout the Near East. Assyrian armies campaigning in Syria, Anatolia, or Iran could locate local iron sources, smelt ore using charcoal from local forests, and forge replacement weapons on campaign. Bronze armies, dependent on tin from distant sources, could not manufacture replacement weapons in the field. Lost or broken bronze weapons represented permanent losses until armies returned home. This difference transformed campaign planning. Assyrian generals could contemplate extended operations knowing that weapon losses could be replaced. Bronze Age generals had to carefully husband equipment, avoiding battles that might result in heavy weapon losses even if tactically advantageous. The willingness to accept casualties and equipment losses, knowing they could be replaced, gave Assyrian commanders flexibility that Bronze Age commanders lacked. The administrative system supporting Assyrian armies reflected this iron-based military economy. Texts from royal archives at Nineveh and Kalhu include inventories of weapons stockpiled at various locations throughout the empire. One tablet lists 1,640 iron swords, 2,670 iron spearheads, and 8,250 iron arrowheads stored at a provincial arsenal. Another records the transfer of 500 iron swords from the main arsenal at Kalhu to a military governor in Syria. These numbers, casual entries in administrative records, reveal military capacity unimaginable in the Bronze Age. The weapons mentioned in single tablets exceeded the entire military equipment of small Bronze Age kingdoms, and these were inventories at provincial arsenals, not the main production centres. The scale of Assyrian military preparation was unprecedented. The supply chain supporting this scale was equally sophisticated. Texts describe iron ore procurement from mines in the Zagros Mountains, Taurus Mountains, and other regions. Charcoal production from managed forests, with specific trees designated for military fuel requirements. Transportation networks moving raw materials to arsenals and finished weapons to military units. Quality control inspections ensuring weapons met specifications. This administrative sophistication, managing resources across a vast empire to support military operations, prefigured later imperial systems. The Roman legions, supplied through similarly sophisticated logistics, were intellectual descendants of Assyrian military organization. The lesson that military power required not just battlefield skill, but administrative capacity and economic resources had been learned through Assyrian experience. The subject peoples of the empire, experiencing this military administrative machine firsthand, developed mixed reactions. Some, recognizing the futility of resistance against such overwhelming power, accommodated themselves to Assyrian rule. Others, burning with resentment at subjugation and brutal treatment, awaited opportunities for rebellion. The revolts that periodically erupted throughout Assyrian history tested whether administrative control could compensate for subject population hostility. Generally, Assyrian military power could suppress rebellions, but the resources required to do so were substantial. Each rebellion required diverting forces from other purposes, weakening frontier defences or delaying planned campaigns. By the mid-7th century BC, the empire was experiencing increasing rebellion frequency. Egypt, conquered by Esarhaddon in 671 BC, rebelled repeatedly and eventually broke free. Babylon, despite massive deportations and resettlements, remained restive. Elam, thoroughly devastated, could not rebel, but required garrison forces that might have been used elsewhere. The overextension problem, familiar from later empires, was becoming acute. Assyrian military power, while still formidable, was spread thin across too much territory, with too many hostile populations. The garrison forces required to hold the empire down were substantial, reducing the forces available for offensive operations or crisis response. And critically, by 650 BC, Assyria's technological advantages had disappeared entirely. Every major power in the Near East possessed iron weapons and iron-working technology comparable to Assyrian capabilities. The Medes, emerging as a major power in the East, equipped their armies with iron weapons forged using techniques learned from Assyria. The Babylonians, long subject to Assyrian rule, had developed independent ironworking industries during brief periods of independence. The loss of technological advantage combined with imperial overextension and subject population hostility created vulnerability. Assyria remained powerful, its armies still formidable, its administrative system still functional. But the overwhelming superiority that had characterized earlier centuries was gone. Enemies could now fight on equal terms. The final crisis began in the 620s BC when Nabopolassar, a Chaldean general, seized control of Babylon and declared independence. Assyrian forces dispatched to suppress the rebellion discovered that Babylonian armies wielded iron weapons equal to their own. The easy victories of earlier centuries were not repeated. Battles became grinding slugfests between Iron Age armies of comparable capability. Simultaneously, the Median Empire under Cyaxares was consolidating power in the east. Median armies, equipped with iron weapons and organized along lines that consciously imitated Assyrian military systems, began pressing on Assyrian eastern frontiers. Assyria, facing major threats on multiple fronts, lacked the forces to deal with both simultaneously. The coalition that formed between Babylon and Media in 614 BC sealed Assyria's fate. Two major powers, both equipped with Iron Age militaries, coordinating operations against an overextended empire proved unstoppable. Assyrian armies, dividing forces to face threats on multiple fronts, were defeated in detail. The capture of Ashur in 614 BC by Median forces demonstrated that Assyrian cities, despite formidable fortifications, could fall to attackers with equivalent technology. The capture of Nineveh in 612 BC by combined Median Babylonian forces ended Assyrian independence. The final Assyrian remnant holding out at Haran was destroyed in 609 BC. The thoroughness of Assyria's destruction was remarkable. The coalition forces deliberately demolished major cities, burning palaces, toppling walls, filling wells, destroying irrigation systems. The intent was clear. Assyria would never rise again, and it never did. The Assyrian people survived, but Assyria as an independent power was finished. The destruction was so complete that within generations the locations of major Assyrian cities were forgotten. Nineveh, once among the world's greatest cities, became a ruin covered by dirt. For over 2,000 years its location was uncertain. Only in the 19th century did archaeological excavations rediscover Assyrian civilization. But the iron technology Assyria had pioneered and perfected persisted. The Median Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and eventually the Persian Empire that succeeded them all, used iron weapons forged with techniques developed by Assyrian smiths. The military systems pioneered by Assyria, professional standing armies with standardized equipment and sophisticated logistics, became models for successor empires. The Persian army that conquered the Near East in the 6th century BC was equipped entirely with iron weapons. Persian soldiers carried iron-tipped spears, iron swords, and wore iron-scale armour virtually identical to Assyrian designs. The Persians had learned from Assyrian example, adapting and improving military systems originally developed in Assyrian arsenals. Alexander the Great's Macedonian army, conquering the Persian Empire in the 4th century BC, wielded iron weapons and wore iron armour. The sarissa, the long pike that gave Macedonian phalanxes their legendary power, had an iron head forged, using techniques ultimately traceable to Assyrian innovations. The chain of military technological development ran directly from Assyrian arsenals through Persian workshops to Macedonian forges. The Roman legions, dominating the Mediterranean world centuries later, were the ultimate inheritors of the Iron Age military revolution. Roman infantry, equipped with iron swords, iron javelins, and iron armour, represented the mature development of military technologies pioneered by Assyria 1,000 years earlier. The gladius, the short sword that armed Roman legionaries, was a direct descendant of iron infantry swords first forged in Assyrian workshops. The historical impact of Assyria's Iron Age military revolution extended far beyond Assyria's own existence. The transformation from bronze to iron in military technology, which Assyria pioneered and exploited, permanently changed warfare. The abundance of iron made large professional armies economically viable. The superior performance of iron weapons made infantry-based tactics dominant. The availability of cheap, effective weapons democratized military power in ways that shaped political development for centuries. In this sense, the Assyrian soldiers who first cut through bronze armour with iron swords in the early 9th century BC initiated changes that echoed through military history into the modern era. The principle that technological advantage translates to military dominance, demonstrated so dramatically by Assyria's rise, became a permanent feature of warfare. The understanding that military power requires not just battlefield skill, but economic capacity and administrative sophistication, learned through Assyrian experience, shaped every subsequent empire. The archaeological sites of Assyria, excavated over the past 2 centuries, preserve physical evidence of this revolution. In museum collections worldwide, iron weapons forged in Assyrian arsenals sit in display cases, silent testimony to the empire that perfected iron metallurgy for war. The swords, spearheads, arrowheads, and armour scales, corroded but intact, represent the technology that built and sustained an empire for 2 centuries. Standing before these artifacts, it requires imagination to reconstruct the moment when iron first cut through bronze, when defenders realized their weapons could not harm attackers, when an entire military tradition became obsolete in an instant. But that moment occurred somewhere in northern Mesopotamia in the early 9th century BC, and it changed the world. The Age of Bronze ended. The Age of Iron began. And Assyria, through superior metallurgy and ruthless application of technological advantage, dominated the transition period absolutely. The thunder of iron weapons echoed across the Near East for 2 centuries, until finally, inevitably, that thunder was turned against Assyria itself by enemies wielding weapons forged in imitation of Assyrian innovations. The empire fell, but the revolution it pioneered persisted. shaping warfare for the next 1,000 years